Israel and Hamas are moving towards the second phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. This requires Israel to withdraw from the territory, and it requires Hamas to lay down its weapons. As Gaza slowly recovers, human rights groups are documenting allegations of war crimes. It's an immense task for investigators on the ground. DW met with one woman who was gathering evidence for international courts.
Sabrine Al-Tatour relives the horrors of the 2-year war almost every day. The field researcher is on her way to record a witness's testimony. Al-Tatour works for the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR, one of the 2 main human rights groups based in Gaza. They are trying to document what happened to people during the war in Gaza. It's a huge challenge.
Some cases, of course, need longer because the field is not easy. It's hard. We might not be able to reach the targeted location, which is an obstacle. I may not be able to reach eyewitnesses or victims because they've moved due to displacement, and that delays things.
Al-Tatour has worked some 20 years for PCHR. In Gaza, they had much to investigate under the Hamas authorities and previous wars. This time, the scope is both huge and very personal. She was displaced 12 times during the war.
In this war, it seems nobody in Gaza was spared harm. It's enough that I, a victim, take testimonies from other victims.
Today, Al-Tatour is meeting a young woman who says she saw Israeli troops kill her grandfather in December 2023. Neema Hamouda tells how afterwards she was detained, taken by the military to Israel, and released after almost 2 months in prison. She was never charged with any offense.
I spent about 45 days in Damon prison. Then I was transferred to Seyda Timan prison in Rahat. I stayed there 5 days, and on the 5th day, I was released. That was probably the worst prison because from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., you had to remain sitting on your knees without moving or leaning back at all. Everything is prohibited.
Mass detentions of Palestinians by the Israeli military during the war were common. It's just one of the many issues human rights organizations look at. We reached out to the Israeli prison service about Neema's detention, but they said they could not comment on individual cases. The IDF did not reply to our query about her grandfather's death. Faced with such a huge task, Gaza's human rights groups cooperate closely to cover as much ground as possible. Samir Sakoud works for the Al-Mizan human rights organization in Gaza.
For example, the targeting of tents. At many times there was targeting of the tent areas in Al-Mawasi, and sometimes bombs weighing a ton were used. Field investigations were carried out using a method of cross-checking information through photos, witness statements, remnants of the bombing, the impact it left, and by turning to experts for analysis and so on, and then a report is issued on this field investigation.
It is unclear whether any of these investigations will result in prosecutions. Israel rejects all accusations of war crimes. It also says its own legal system can investigate any alleged violations. The rights groups are continuing their work regardless. Once a case is built, information is also shared with the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. In September of this year, the US imposed sanctions on the organizations for their work with the ICC and the complaints they filed with it against Israel back in 2023.
I believe accountability will come to human rights violators, even if it takes time. Monitoring, documentation, and collecting information with precision and credibility will play a role in reaching the truth.
Human rights workers say that despair and losing hope are their worst enemies. Instead, they choose to continue investigating, documenting, and laying the groundwork for justice, one step at a time.
Well, I'm joined now by Alexa Koenig. She's co-director of the Human Rights Center in Berkeley, California. She focuses on the intersection of emerging technologies and human rights. Alexa, it's good to have you with us. The report that we just saw, it speaks to the fact that independent foreign journalists were not allowed on the ground in Gaza during the war. The verification process that's carried out by journalists was simply interrupted amidst claims of human rights abuses. Do you see Gaza as the ideal place for new technologies to be used to help collect and analyze important information?
Any context where reporters from outside a country can't get into that country becomes a really critical use case for bringing in new technologies to help make sense of what's happening on the ground. And also, as you've just mentioned, for verifying the accuracy of that information. One of the things that we helped produce with the United Nations was something called the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations, which sets international standards for how to do that work responsibly.
Yeah, much of your work focuses on open source information for human rights organizations. Let's flesh that out a little bit. I mean, how can open sources help detect human rights abuses?
Well, first, what open sources are is publicly accessible information. We particularly focus on information that's circulating in online spaces. So things like social media content, government reporting, NGO reporting, et cetera. One of the ways that that can be really helpful is to begin to corroborate other information that may be collected to try to establish the facts of what's happened on the ground in conflict or crisis. There's really three buckets of information that are helpful to investigators when they're trying to establish that evidentiary record. First, they want to get as many testimonies of survivors, witnesses, or experts that they can find. Second, they're really looking for any kind of physical evidence, so fragments of weapons or soil samples, et cetera, that may indicate the kinds of weapons being used in that conflict. And third, and this is where the open source information comes in, is documentary evidence. Traditionally, that would be things like contracts or written orders, et cetera. But increasingly in the 21st century, what we're seeing is the utility of videos, photographs, and other information that may be posted online.
Is there an example that you can think of off the top of your head where this Berkeley Protocol has been implemented and has actually brought to light a crime that otherwise would have remained hidden?
I think whenever we're looking at conflict or crisis today, we're really trying to bring together the information from people closest to that conflict and crisis with the information that an independent and international community can gather from external sources. The gold standard in any war crimes investigation is to bring together that testimonial, documentary, and physical evidence and see if it all points in the same direction. Where something like the Berkeley Protocol helps is it provides new techniques and methodologies for finding information. What a lot of the public doesn't know is that when you go into a search engine and you put in your keywords, you're only getting to about 4% of the information that's available on the internet. So thinking about ways that you can get to that other 96% becomes really critical for making sure you have the fullest possible evidentiary record. The other ways that it's really helped is to help separate fact from fiction. So one of the challenges we, of course, have in an online operating environment are things like propaganda, things that have been miscontextualized. Deep fakes are, of course, increasingly problematic. What the Berkeley Protocol provides is a framework for assessing the reliability and authenticity of the information that's circulating in these digital spaces. And there's really three things any investigator, if they're following the provisions of the Berkeley Protocol, are going to do. They're going to check the technical data to make sure, see if there's any indicators of when and where something was captured, to see if it really is depicting, for example, something that just happened on the ground in Gaza. Second, they're going to look at the content, and they're going to use a process called geolocation to compare, say, a video or a photograph with satellite imagery to see if you can confirm the location. They'll also engage in something called chronolocation, which is assessing the time. And finally, and perhaps most important, they'll engage in something called source analysis, which is assessing the reliability of the source who posted this information to find out if they have been reliable in past contexts, if they are actually on the ground in Gaza, or if there's indicators that this may in some way have been fabricated.
So what you're doing, if I'm understanding you right, you're describing a 21st century detective slash forensics slash investigator who can gather evidence without physically being on site. which I'm sure there are some leaders around the world who don't want to see that happen because they've been able to bank on keeping journalists and investigators out to keep their secrets hidden. I know a lot of people, though, listening to this, watching this, are going to say, how can we, though, be sure that the information gathered through open sources and presented in courts, that's the most important thing as evidence, is real and not fake? I mean, how much risk do we have to tolerate with this?
Great question. I think one of the reasons we did create the Berkeley Protocol is to help judges, to help fact finders, investigators, and the general public have a way to actually assess the quality of information. One of the challenges, of course, today in a digital environment is that information is transmitted at such speed and scale that for the everyday user, you often can't engage in a really rigorous process of analysis. But when you have critical information that's going to come into a court of law, you're going to go through this really stringent process of checking if metadata is still attached. That's the information about the video or the photograph or the post itself. That can give really strong indicators of whether something has been manipulated, or using Photoshop or another tool to basically change a piece of information in ways that can be problematic for getting to the truth. Doing this content analysis process to confirm the who, what, when, where, why, and how something may have happened. And of course, again, to assess the source. I think it's really important in today's world to know that there are these ways to check the quality of the underlying information. To date, we've seen this information be really critical in the context of Ukraine, as well as Gaza and Syria. We saw it used at the International Criminal Court to issue the first ever arrest warrant based almost entirely on digital open source information for a Libyan warlord, essentially. So we are seeing an uptake of a lot of these methodologies as confidence grows that there are ways to actually assess the quality of this data.
And what about the blowback? I know that some of the organizations gathering evidence in Gaza have been sanctioned by the United States. I mean, does that mean that their evidence cannot stand up in a court of law? Are they tainted in any way by that?
No, I don't know about them as individuals or as organizations, but the underlying data is essentially something that can be assessed on its own merits. So I do think the importance of preserving the historical record so that it can be vetted by courts of law and official processes becomes really critical, regardless of that source. Now, the quality of the work of that source is, of course, going to have some degree of bearing on the level of scrutiny that is going to be brought to that information. But at the end of the day, something that is assessed as reliable, that is assessed as authentic, should be accorded the representative weight in courts going forward.
And let me ask you, Alexa, before we run out of time, what guidance do you give to organizations that are engaged in collecting evidence?
A few things. One, to be really aware of the holistic security environment in which they're operating. Whenever you go online and you start pulling information from digital spaces, you're leaving digital footprints. And that could potentially be risky for your organization or for yourself if there's anyone who's not appreciating the kinds of work that you're actually doing. It's also about having a sensitivity to the ethics. This is, of course, pulling together information about people in moments of crisis. So thinking about how we uphold the inherent dignity of each person who's impacted, to not make accusations until you're absolutely sure of your facts, and to help to put good quality information out into the world is one of the most important things you can do. Lastly, I'd say to follow the best practices and guidance in documents like the Berkeley Protocol. We have a new set of guidelines that are just being launched right now on using this information to document sexual and gender-based violence. I think really adhering to ethical and legal standards is critical.
Alexa Koenig, co-director of the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, California. Alexa, fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by Andrew Gilmour. He's a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. He's spent over 3 decades working in conflict zones, including the Middle East. Mr. Gilmour, it's good to have you with us. How important is the work of these Palestinian human rights NGOs, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's Extremely important. Accountability for any set of major crimes, war crimes, is vital. And but what makes this particularly important is that Israel has prevented any international investigators going. So therefore, the only possible solution to get any sort of investigation is to have the Palestinians. Your report just then mentioned that the Israelis said there's no need because that they've got their own method of investigation. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been one single example of accountability for one single action taken since October 2023. So the idea that somehow the whole international community should be banned from entering Gaza in order to carry out the investigation, and meanwhile they were, of course, making life as impossible as they can for the Palestinian organizations, means that their work, difficult though it is absolutely crucial.
What about the work of these NGOs? Will they also be collecting evidence of alleged crimes committed by Palestinian groups such as Hamas, or is this only alleged crimes committed by Israel?
Well, they're inside Gaza. They cannot investigate the massive crime committed by Hamas on October the 7th. 2023, so they can't investigate that. They can only and there are no crimes against Israelis committed inside Gaza because the Israelis have been killing them by aircraft and by drones and by snipers. So there are no crimes committed that direction. I mean, in the West Bank, yes, Palestinians go and investigate in both directions, but the ones inside Gaza, there is only one set of crimes for them to be investigating.
Well, are we certain, though, that there were no war crimes of any sort that were committed by Hamas, or are we looking at this simply because Israel is a nation state and Hamas is not?
No, clearly, what Hamas did on October the 7th, when they burst out of Gaza and committed horrific crimes inside Israel, those are unquestionably crimes. But the investigators in the Palestinian NGOs in Gaza can't investigate them. They can't get out of their prison, basically. So, I mean, they're not investigating the crimes committed by Hamas. No.
I mean, my question to you, Mr. Gilmour, is there an openness to investigating the possibility of crimes committed by Hamas against Palestinians inside Gaza?
Committed against Palestinians?
Correct.
Oh, I see. Okay, I thought you meant against Israelis. Yes, there is a possibility of that. Of course, it's not very secure for them to be doing that, but equally, it's not very secure for them to be investigating against Israelis either. Yes, indeed. I thought you meant investigating the crime that Hamas committed on the 7th of October. Yes, they should be doing that.
The United States, I'm sure you're aware, has sanctioned these NGOs for working with the International Criminal Court. How do these sanctions, how do they affect the work of these organizations?
They add an extra layer of massive impediment, of course. The Israelis have done it also for international officials working for the International Criminal Court and for the UN Special Rapporteur. The US sanctions prevent people using their own bank account or being able to open their own email accounts if they're based on an American server. The sanctions are absolutely huge. And it has made life very, very hard for the Palestinian organizations who were already being sanctioned for a different set of reasons by the Israelis before October the 7th, under the guise that they were anti-Semitic and pro-terrorist. So they were being prevented from doing their work in the West Bank and Gaza before October 2023. But now the American condition, which is a different set, that they're not being accused of anti-Semitism or pro-terrorism by the Americans. They're being accused of just collaborating with the International Criminal Court.
Mr. Gilmour, before we run out of time, I want to ask you, how do you assess Israel's stance of categorically denying any responsibility for alleged war crimes in Gaza?
Well, everybody who commits war crimes says they didn't do it. You've never come across a government that says, yes, we did it. I mean, Germany did after the Second World War, but nobody else does. So, of course, the Israelis are doing that. Their position is based on the following, that every single judge on the International Court of Justice, including the German, the British, and the American, that they're all anti-Semitic, that every official in the International Criminal Court, that every organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Red Cross, every other Médecins Sans Frontières, everybody is basically anti-Semitic. That is their line. And I don't buy that. And frankly, nobody, no genuine human rights official or organization in the world buys that line.
The former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Andrew Gilmour. Mr. Gilmour, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.